with her. And so just to interrupt what I was saying, we're being recorded. So just so you know that if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn your cameras off, and we won't be recording in any of the breakout rooms. I think you're going to need to say that it's okay to be recorded. Did you all get a little message? Yeah, so Esther's going to be sharing with us her lifelong work with reparatory justice and counter-racism campaigning. She's a jury consult, reparationist, and interdisciplinary law and history scholar activist. She's been engaged in local, national, and international justice activism for over 20 years. Esther is the founder of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, and she's going to be giving us an overview of that tonight. She also co-leads the Stop the Mangamese campaign and is part of the recently launched all-party parliamentary group on African reparations, which is a group beginning a wider conversation about the ongoing impact of past wrongs, but at a parliamentary level. As well as hearing about Esther's work there, we'll also have the opportunity in the session to have group discussions, and there'll be some questions, time for questions. And Jameson can share the, if that's okay, Jameson, who's another one in the collective, can share the kind of timings in the chat if anyone wants to know the timings. Just for a moment before we start, I just thought it might take a moment to collectively breathe together. So you can turn your video off if you want, or you don't need to, just close your eyes if you're happy to. And just placing your hands somewhere on your body, we're just going to breathe in together, breathing in and breathing out. And then we're going to breathe in again, and this time thinking about taking in all of the space and all of the people in the room. And as you breathe out, grounding your feet into the ground, connecting back to the earth. Then a final breath, and this time reaching in the spaces above and below. So you might want to physically reach, you might not want to. And then just bringing your presence and your focus into this session. And I'm going to hand over to Esther.
Thank you. Okay, well, greetings everyone. I'm gonna, sorry, I wasn't quite ready, but that's fine. Thank you for turning up tonight. I'm going to be talking shortly about my work around reparations. I'm a reparationist, which is a reparations campaigner and activist. But before I do that, well, actually it's not before, I've made it part of my presentation. So I need to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Bear with me. And I'm also going to be sharing my sound as well. Yep, sharing sound. Let me just put that on full. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the image of me for tonight's talk. Right, great. All right. So the aims of this talk are to introduce yourselves as anti-racist action learners to the history and work of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, which by acronym we refer to it as the ISMAR. I'm not actually a founder of it because the ISMAR is an intergenerational movement which goes back several centuries, and in the UK to the mid-1700s, but I am one of the modern day people that have related to this movement and have helped to kind of build it and strengthen it in the last 20 years. I'm also going to be describing the campaign objectives of the UK contingent of the ISMAR and provide examples of initiatives and efforts being made to, effect and secure holistic reparatory justice within and beyond the UK. And in this regard, I am going to also be highlighting my own lifelong counter-racism activism as a system change reparationist, as well as my own PhD action research on the history of the ISMA between the 1990s and actually this year, 2021. Because a lot of the information that I share is not just my own experience, it's also the products of my own historical research on a movement that I'm part of, which is quite cool to be able to research a movement that you're part of. But I wanted to begin, first of all, with a tribute, and it's not a departure. It's actually in good order, because many of those who today we would call earth defenders were reparationists in terms of stopping harm and seeking to repair the damages caused by enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonization as well. And today, in 1995, it's the anniversary of the assassination of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was assassinated by the Nigerian government at the behest of Shell Oil Company. And I've included a quote here from Ken Saro-Wiwa, I think quite appropriately in the context of this course, and also linking reparations activism to anti-racist activism. So he says, "It is genocide. I accuse the oil companies of practicing racism because they do in Ogoni what they do not do in other parts of the world." And I'm mentioning this not just because today is a day that I would normally be out commemorating the work of Ken and others who have had their lives taken. But today is also a special day because there's an international vigil that I was meant to be part of, but I'm here, which is honouring the lives of martyred and persecuted earth defenders. Of course, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9 are some of them, but there is one closer to home who was recently killed in Ghana, a young brother called Elom, that we worked with in the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and he was just around 24. So at COP, they've been doing a 24-hour vigil. There will be a vigil in Brixton, and there will also be one in Ghana. And so I'm not able to participate, but I did say I would mention it here in the context of dedicating this talk actually to all of these people, to remind us and to remind me of the work that it is that I do and why it's so important to do it. So in that vein, I just want to share with you a reading that I did, which was last year, to commemorate the life and legacy of Ken Saro-Wiwa, which I think is quite appropriate to begin this talk. So it's about 5-6 minutes long, so take a listen. Actually, the statement that Ken Saro-Wiwa was prevented from reading on the 10th of November 1995 at the end of his trial by the military tribunal that sentenced him to death by hanging. My Lord, we all stand before history. I am a man of peace, of ideas, appalled by the denigrating poverty of my people who live on a richly endowed land, distressed by their political marginalization and economic strangulation, angered by the devastation of their land, anxious to preserve their right to life and to a decent living, and determined to usher to this country as a whole, a fair and just democratic system, I have decided and devoted all of my intellectual and material resources, my very life, to a cause in which I have total belief and from which I cannot be blackmailed or intimidated. I have no doubt at all about the ultimate success of my cause, no matter the trials and tribulations which I and those who believe with me may encounter on our journey. Nor imprisonment nor death can stop our ultimate victory. I repeat that we all stand before history. I and my colleagues are not the only ones on trial. Shell is on trial here, and it is as well that it is represented by counsel said to be holding a watching brief. The company has indeed ducked this particular trial, but its day will surely come, and the lessons learned here may prove useful to it. For there is no doubt in my mind that the ecological war the company has waged in the Delta will be called to question sooner than later, and the crimes of that war be duly punished. The crime of the company's dirty wars against the Ogoni people will also be punished. On trial also is the Nigerian nation, its present rulers and all those who assist them. I am not one of those who shy away from protesting injustice and oppression, arguing that they are expected of a military regime. The military do not act alone. They are supported by a gaggle of politicians, lawyers, judges, academics, and businessmen, all of them hiding under the claim that they are only doing their duty. Men and women too afraid to wash their pants of their urine. We all stand on trial, my Lord, for by our actions we have denigrated our country and jeopardized the future of our children. As we subscribe to the subnormal and accept double standards, as we lie and cheat openly, as we protect injustice and oppression, we empty our classrooms, degrade our hospitals, and make ourselves the slaves of those who subscribe to higher standards, who pursue the truth and honor justice, freedom, and hard work. I predict that the scene here will be played and replayed by generations yet unborn. Some have already cast themselves in the role of villains. Some are tragic victims. Some still have the chance to redeem themselves. The choice is for each individual. I predict that a denouement of the riddle of the Niger Delta will soon come. The agenda is being set at this trial. Whether the peaceful ways I have favoured will prevail depends on what the oppressor decides, what signals it sends out to the waiting public. In my innocence of the false charges I face here, in my utter conviction, I call upon the Ogoni people, the peoples of the Niger Delta, and the oppressed ethnic minorities of Nigeria to stand up now and fight fearlessly and peacefully for their rights. History is on their side. God is on their side.
For the Holy Quran says in Surah 42, verse 41, all those who fight when oppressed incur no guilt, but Allah shall punish the oppressor come the day. Thank you.
Okay, alrighty.
Actually,
Sorry. So that was actually a speech I gave at 55 Tufton Street as part of Extinction Rebellion Writers Rebel, acknowledging the work of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was, among many other things, also a writer. So I think that leads me nicely into my talk, recognizing the intergenerational nature of the movement that I am part of and am really still a child in. And just really, because this is a very special day, it's a solemn day, and I felt it was important to join in solidarity with these actions happening around the world. So I need to begin, because I can talk all night about reparations, but I will be very precise tonight, which will be difficult. I'm just going to begin with some basic terminology that you will hear me using, and one of which is in the name of the campaign that I represent, among many other reparations formations, called the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. Now, Maangamizi is a Kiswahili word that basically transliterates as sort of like an African Holocaust, but it really speaks to the continuum of chattel, colonial and neo-colonial forms of enslavement. So it's a system of oppression, transgenerational oppression and injustice, okay, that's particularly has impacted people of African heritage and ancestry, but also has extended to impact other peoples and in truth, our very Mother Earth. So the term was popularized by somebody called Professor Malena Karenga, who is an African ethicist, African American, and he wrote a paper on the ethics of reparations, and he says that Maangamizi speaks to a Holocaust of enslavement, and by this he means a morally monstrous act of genocide that is not only against the people, but also a crime against humanity and a sin against the Creator, a morally monstrous destruction of life, human culture, and human possibility. Now, Professor Karenga actually kind of uses the term Maangamizi to speak to historic enslavement, chattel enslavement, but the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe that I'm a co-founder of and the co-vice chair of, we have evolved some of this knowledge that has been created, and we refer to the Maangamizi not only in terms of the past, but the current impacts of the past in the continuation of this systemic form of oppression and dispossession. And he advocates that we should use the term Maangamizi rather than terms which you often hear like slave trade and stuff like that, because actually we're talking about human beings, and they were enslaved and they were conscious of their enslavement. They were, so to talk about slaves is very pejorative and actually quite insulting to those of us who are of African ancestry, although it is common language that is used. But he says that when we say slave trade to refer to the origins of the case or the claim for reparations, in a broad sense, the injuries are distorted and hidden that African people experience. It sanitizes the high levels of violence, mass murder that was inflicted on African people and our societies, and in truth, Mother Earth. It becomes more of a commercial issue rather than a moral one. And since trade is the primary focus, then the mass murder and genocide that African people experience can simply be attributed to collateral damage of a commercial venture wrong. Sorry, this Yeah, okay. So that's really what the term Maangamizi means. This slide is actually out of place, but it speaks to the damage. So the Abuja Proclamation of 1993, which was a famous conference that took place in Nigeria, called the First Pan-African Reparations Conference. And it recognized that the damage sustained by the African peoples is not a thing of the past, but is painfully manifested in the damaged lives of contemporary Africans from Harlem to Harare, in the damaged economies of the Black world, from Guinea to Guyana, from Somalia to Suriname. There is a coalition in America called the National Coalitions of Blacks for Reparations in America. And they also have spoken about the 5 injury areas. And these are, when we're talking about what is the harm of the Maangamizi that requires repair, they speak about injuries to African people's sense of being a people and their sense of nationhood, the injury areas of education, health, criminal punishment, they say, but we would talk about criminal injustice, and obviously wealth and poverty. So intergenerational wealth passing down in terms of enslavers and their descendants, and then intergenerational impoverishment for the enslaved and their descendants, okay? And the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign also frames what we have experienced as genocide, but we're not the only ones that have done that. In fact, in the 1950s, 1951, there was a famous petition called the We Charge Genocide petition that was developed by an organization called the Civil Rights Congress of the United States of America. Famous lawyers, Patterson, Paul Robeson, many others, Claudia Jones if you've heard of these people, were signatories and very involved in developing this petition. So, but the coiner of the term genocide is Dr. Raphael Lemkin, and he wrote a book in 1944 called The Axis of Evil. And he was very interested in how you destroy groups, okay? And he discovered that genocide has 2 phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. And by national pattern, he's referring to the institutions. So institutions of governance, politics, the culture, the health institutions, the economic institutions, the institutions which help a people basically develop and thrive. But then the other aspect of the genocide is the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor or the colonizer. So that is genocide. And even if you look at the definition of the 1948 Genocide Convention, you will see that genocide is not what people think of it in terms of just being like a direct mass killing of people. It speaks to an intent to destroy a group or a particular, on the grounds of their race or ethnicity or their nationality or some other type of group factor. So that is why reparations, there has been and continues to be throughout the generations, movements for reparations. So what does the reparations mean? Holistically, in the mass media, the corporate media, there's always a very reductive conversation about reparations, that reparations is used to how much how much are we owed and should we be paid and stuff like that. And even though compensation is an aspect of reparations, that is not the meaning of reparations, and it's certainly not the starting point. So for people like me, a large part of my work has been around educating the publics, various publics of different groupings about the meaning of reparations as African people, indigenous peoples, other colonized peoples have shaped it, have been organizing about it, because a lot of the time our voices, the knowledges that we create are marginalized and are not really kind of given or amplified. So just to say that the notion of reparation is quite an ancient one. The principle has existed for centuries, and one of the earliest kind of formulations from an African perspective around jurisprudence, which is the science and philosophy of law, is from something called the Mande Charter of 1222, the Mandinka Declaration of Human and People's Rights. And in the Mande Charter, it talks about if a life is attacked and there is a need to repair, every life being a life, any harm caused to a life requires reparation. So it's as I said, a centuries old process, but there is no uniform theory on reparations for all people. All groups, according to their own histories and cultures and their own epistemologies, have developed and shaped reparations meanings according to what they say is the harm they have experienced and what needs to be repaired and how. So coming again to Professor Karenga, he has this lovely quote that I think really encapsulates the work that I and others do and have been doing, that is often kind of not recognized. He says, reparations is a process of the repairing and remaking of a people who are in the process and practice of repairing, renewing, and remaking the world. And in fact, that's a very similar concept to the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, which means repair of the world. So a lot of the time when you go into specific group who've experienced historical and contemporary oppression, you will find similar types of global justice conceptualizations of the meaning of repair. Anyhow, in the international social movement, we use two main frameworks on reparations. The first being what we call the conceptual framework, which is the big picture stuff. And that has been offered by somebody called Professor Xoesi, who is a Nigerian public intellectual who was at that 1993 conference, and he presented a paper. And there's a lovely quote that I haven't got time to read, but I've just put on the slide the different aspects of the holistic repairs that Xoesi refers to. So you can sort of see, you know, mental, psychological, cultural, organizational, institutional, social, economic, political, educational, family repairs, relationship repairs, repairs in our sense of self and group esteem, repairs to our sense of dignity, value, and worth, and also repairs to our reputation. And he says that more important, Xoesi says, than any monies to be received, and more fundamental than any lands to be recovered, is the opportunity the reparations campaign offers us for the rehabilitation of Black people, by Black people, for Black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our material conditions, our collective reputations, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religious and political traditions, and our family institutions, but first and foremost for the rehabilitation of our minds. The most important part of reparation is our self-repair. The change it will bring about in our understanding of our history, of ourselves and of our destiny, the change it will bring about in our place in the world. So these are just some placards from reparations protests in the UK, in particular the what used to be the annual African Emancipation Day reparations march on the 1st of August, which we refer to as Mosiah. And you can see on my left, Repair Nation is reparation. And the children on my right have you know, slides that speak to reparations as internal and external repair. So the internal repair is self-repair, what what the colonized have to do to restore themselves. And then the external is what others owe in terms of accountability and responsibility. Okay. So the other framework on reparations is what's known as the international law framework. And it comes from the basic principles and guidelines on the right to and reparation for victims of gross violations of human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. And that speaks to 5 main aspects of a holistic and comprehensive reparations framework, strategy, set of remedies. First being the cessation of the violations, assurances and guarantees of non-repetition, which is the aspect of reparations that is least emphasized for people of African heritage and ancestry. So that is about how do you stop harm? So how do we stop racism today? That's one of the most direct, everyday manifestations of the Ma'angamizi. How do we envision a world without any racism at all? Okay, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and measures of rehabilitation. This is the meaning of reparations under international law. Going back to my point about each group kind of reparations in their own way. And so in the UK has been very unique in that all people of African heritage and ancestry, regardless of where we were born or how we self-identify, but if we've identified with reparations movements, it's been framed as an African reparations movement, which is quite interesting because what you see in other parts of the world is like a regionalization. So in the Caribbean, you're talking about Caribbean reparations or CARICOM, which is the economic bloc that has a kind of reparation strategy in terms of states. In North America, so-called, they'll talk about reparations for African people or Black people in America. In the UK, because of the long history of Pan-Africanism, and for many other reasons, largely that our demographics have always been small, we haven't had the luxury, as it were, to separate out into these different groups. We've seen the commonality of our experiences and realized that we are stronger together and united and sort of joined forces, whether people were born directly in Africa or the Caribbean or other parts of the diaspora, or even, in Europe, as it may. So African reparations is an approach to reparations where there's a harmonization of approaches to reparations that people of African heritage take globally. Second, that what's integral to reparations is reclaiming Africa as a homeland. And what that means is stopping the recolonization of Africa that is actually happening today. But it also is about asserting a right to belong, which is a right to citizenship, irrespective of whether we physically live on that continent or not, okay? And it's about reclaiming a sense of being African, something that was denigrated, demonized. So it's not just about anti-Blackness, it's about being rooted in African societies, African cultures, African indigeneity that was demonized in the process of the chattel enslavement of African people, where we were reduced to being 3/5 of a human being in, say, the US Constitution, and there wasn't a recognition of our heritage and cultures. And another aspect of it is that reparations pursuits have entailed freedom or liberation from the continuation of the Ma'angamizi. So in times of chattel enslavement, it was about ending chattel enslavement. In times of direct colonialism, it was about ending that. And in times of neo-colonialism today, it's about ending that system of neo-colonialism today. So it's not just pay us some money so we can live more comfortably because our ancestors worked for all this money. It is about the systemic changes. And another key aspect is it entails planet repairs, which I shall go on to explain. And these aspects become central to the global strategies and tactics of reparationists to effect and secure reparatory justice. So I always use the language of effecting and securing because they are active terms. They are not passive where it's about we're waiting to be paid, okay? It's about what we are in the driving seat of doing by our own people's power, including compelling others to do the right thing, okay? So another key part of reparations is there has to be cognitive justice. So we have to transcend Euroliteracy. We have to repair the knowledges that we're using even to conceptualize and define our realities and then envision the alternatives, okay? And reparations must also entail, and this is one of another specialist, Dr. Dati Kumoji, who's a specialist in Indigenous African knowledge systems. It must entail restoring Indigenous African knowledge systems of language, spirituality and philosophy, music, art and symbolism, science and technology, resulting in Africa and African people redefining our knowledge systems, both on the continent, but also in the diaspora. So in the last minutes, and going slightly over, I'm just going to share a little bit about some of the work that is being done in the UK, apart from obviously demystifying reparations and correcting many kind of misrepresentations of what the movement is about. There's been a long history of reparations activism in the UK. So in my own PhD research in history, one of the landmarks is, in terms of a reparations theorist and organizer, Atobo Kwajo Kugwano, who is an African abolitionist, and he wrote this book, The Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery. And he was the first published African critic of the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans, the first African to demand publicly the total abolition of what we refer to as the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans, or transoceanic, and the freeing of enslaved Africans and our right to resist. But he also called for in the book, he also called for restitution for the injuries of enslavement. And I've already mentioned that in the UN framework, which was actually codified in 2005, it mentions restitution. So this is just an image from my own research of some of the leading activists for reparations in between 1990 and 2020, some of whom people may recognize. The late Bernie Grant is well known, African Guyanese Labour MP in Tottenham. There are people underneath him, Dorothy Kuya, who was an anti-racist organizer in Liverpool and was one of the first kind of race equality workers that we had in this country. And there are many others who I haven't necessarily got the time to go through everybody's kind of story, but to say that the movement has been kept alive largely by people who have subscribed to forms of Pan-Africanism. Yeah, that's one thing that all of these activists, including myself, have had in common. We've all been Pan-Africanist or subscribed to Pan-African ideology and activism. Okay, what is being advocated as repair? So the late Bernie Grant MP in 1993, and this is my last few minutes now, just whistle stop on what's been going on. When he went to this conference in Nigeria, the first conference on reparations, he came back and he issued an early day motion in the British Houses of Parliament in 1993, calling for recognition of reparations. And this is just the actual text of the motion. He then co-founded an organization called the African Reparations Movement, and on the images here, there are some other co-founders, so Dorothy Kuya, Linda Bellos, who was again a Labour councillor in Lambeth, hugely involved in different types of activism, Professor Kimani Nahusi, who wasn't part of the kind of leadership structure, but he was very instrumental in developing the academic kind of justification for reparations, as he is an African historian. And then there was a famous debate in the House of Lords in 1996. And this is a quote from the 15th Viscount of Falkland, Lucius Carey, hereditary peer, who said, "The African people are extremely forgiven. They have forgotten the inequities that they suffered in recent times. To encourage the kind of attitude of fervent desire for reparation here would go against the grain, certainly among Africans, because it is not in their nature." This was just in 1996. So after that, around 2003, I was active for a couple of years by this time, and there was an organization called the Black Quest for Justice campaign that initiated a legal action for Pan-African reparations. And I was a legal advisor to this, and it was to prosecute Her Royal Majesty Elizabeth II for the so-called transatlantic slave trade, apartheid, and other crimes against humanity. And this was about on behalf of, African people worldwide, okay? We came up with a 10-point plan in 2003 that included, I haven't got the time to go into all of it, but it included stuff like debt repudiation, not cancellation, voluntary repatriation for those who wanted to return to Africa, campaigns for free healthcare, free education, returning of the Benin bronzes and many other things. It included the right to kind of build communities and so forth. So this is the Black Quest for Justice campaign. This was us when we initiated this historic legal action. This was some of the newspaper reports from, it was reported in the Black press. Awful headline from The Voice, "Where's the money, mum? Campaigners look to sue the monarch for reparations." That's from 2002. Well, suffice to say, the outcome of that was that we were told you cannot sue Queen Elizabeth II because she's sovereign, immune from prosecution. But we were told if we could prove that there were crimes against humanity that we were experiencing today, that we should go and report them to the local police station. That was literally what we were told. So in 2004, we still continued. This was the bicentenary of the Haitian Revolution in 1804, and the British government were trying to ignore it, although it was being commemorated by the UN. So we formed an organization called the Rendezvous of Victory, which was African-led but cross-community. And we had Fiona McTaggart MP, Labour MP for Stroud, who was then the Home Office Minister for Race and Communities. And we launched this program, Commemorations 2004, Time to Resolve the Big Question of Reparations, where she's actually recorded using the term reparations because we've done lots of lobbying and educating of elected officials like her. And then what they did is they removed her from her position, and then we got John Prescott, and then we began to get all the preparations for 2007, the Wilberwash years, which was about the commemorations of the British Parliamentary Abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, where the narrative shifted from Africans liberating themselves to European abolitionists freeing Africans. So that was part of the counterinsurgency. This was just a newspaper report of myself commenting on Blair's infamous statement of regret in 2006. And I think this was in the Telegraph or the Observer. And yeah, they were basically saying that I had just emerged as a spokesperson for the movement because I was in it lists many different organizations that I was part of. So the real goals of reparations for us as people of African heritage, I'm going to go through these, but not in a lot of depth. But one of the main things I would say, actually, is the big goal is about seeing a liberated Africa, because we recognize that our lives, you know, there's a movement, Black Lives Matter, but we take the view that our lives as people of African heritage and ancestry will not matter in the diaspora when our mother, which we came from, you know, were ripped from, has been trampled upon and continues to be trampled upon. And we've never regained sovereignty, and we've been, you know, cut off, displaced and dispossessed, okay? So one of the goals, just like for Jewish people to establish a homeland, not getting into the politics of the state of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but that right to a homeland, which has been central to many reparation struggles, not just the Jewish one. And so this homeland for us is a liberated Africa that is an Africa without borders, that eradicates those borders that were put there in 1884, 1885, that carved up Africa along the lines of European, you know, coloniality. And it's an Africa based on African, you know, cosmovision and the best of what we have produced in terms of our philosophical systems around governance and justice and fairness, which we refer to as Ma'at, from the peoples of ancient Kemet, which you all know as Egypt. And it's basically a participatory democratic union of communities. It's not the Westphalian model of statehood that is a domination model, okay? But it's about people living in harmony with each other and practicing how to live in harmony with all other members of the human family, which is known as Ubuntu. And we call that future state Ma'at Ubuntu. And the virtues of Ma'at are here: truth, righteousness, harmony, balance, reciprocity, justice, and order, epitomized by a goddess, and the feminine principle of restoring balance and equilibrium. And Ubuntu is about recognizing that we are people, and it has its roots in African humanist philosophy. Now, the other aspect, as a big picture stuff, is about what we refer to as rematriation, which is the right to return, but not only physically return, but the right to belong. And for those of us who are not going to physically return, that we have a right to connect to our homeland through what we call satellite communities of what we call non-territorial autonomy, where we build communities where we can be repairing ourselves. We have access to land, even in Europe, where many of us have settled, but these satellite communities are connected to our motherland. And that is how we believe that we can be whole and repair ourselves and be restituted, and we can rehabilitate ourselves. So this map here really sort of kind of describes these linkages with Africa and where African people have peopled the planet, but who claim a positive racial identity as an African or people of African heritage. So those are the two kind of big ideas. And so everything else fits under that. So all the other things that you often hear about, they fit within that structural framework. So you get to see a community repairing itself. And in my last 2 minutes, the Stop the Mangamizi campaign has been very, very instrumental. It's not the only reparations organization, but it's been very instrumental in actually popularizing the work of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, forming alliances with other peoples who've got reparation struggles, and also making the link between historic enslavement, chattel enslavement, colonialism, and today what people would call environmental reparations or climate reparations, okay? And we have two main goals as part of our campaign: to set up an all-party, a UK and EU all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, and to also develop what we refer to as like a people's tribunal that we refer to as the Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal for Global Justice, because just like when Jewish people experienced the Jewish Holocaust, they didn't go to Nazi courts. They had to set up Nuremberg tribunals. So there is not an existing court on the planet that can adjudicate in a conventional legal sense African reparations claims. Okay, and another aspect of that work is about, for us, direct action, non-violent direct action, but also where people need to, they have to liberate themselves by other means. Shutting down what we refer to as Maangamizi crime scenes, the sites of extractivism today that are pillaging the planet as well. These need to be shut down because this is part of the harm that's continuing, and this the contemporary phase of the Pan-African movement globally, of which we're part of. You would have heard about the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, and we have a petition which will also be shared with yourselves. And yes, I'm just going to now come to the last slide. Just to let you know that where has it all got to? So in July 2020, we had historic motions in Lambeth Council and Islington Council calling for an end to the, they're called reparations and atonement motions, sorry, or the other way around, atonement and reparations motions for the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans. And these motions, among other things, were calling to stop racism, anti-Black racism, and its specific manifestation of Afrophobia, which is anti-African prejudice and discrimination. But also these motions were calling for local councils to support the demands of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign to central government that the UK government established this all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. In October 2020, the Green Party of England and Wales, that we work with very closely, passed a motion at their national conference that supports reparations in the way that we have articulated it. And because of the environmental dimensions, it was also very attractive to them. And this has become now official party policy of the Green Party of England and Wales, okay? In Bristol City Council in March of this year, the motion was passed, and that was a huge achievement to have a city council such as Bristol and its historic links to enslavement and its contemporary legacies pass this motion. So what when Liverpool is going to pass the motion, and we're discussing it in Manchester and other parts of the country, where people are coming together, elected officials are being empowered to act and take decisions at the local or city level as a way of, you know, forcing the change from the ground up, okay? So that these are just some of the newspaper reports of where we're at in the movement. And what was significant about the Bristol motion is that it called for this process of developing reparations plans to be led by African heritage communities. That was the wording that was used. So it's not other people doing it for us. And most recently, at the end of October, the Stop the Maangamizi campaign was involved in lobbying elected officials in not only the Labour Party, the Green Party, to set up an all-party parliamentary group on African reparations. And that was taken up and chaired by Bel Ribeiro MP, Marsha de Cordova MP, both Labour MPs, Caroline Lucas, Green MP, and Sir Peter Bottomley, who is the Conservative MP that you have to have. So this is where really the movement has got to, and I will stop here. Thank you.
just wanted to say a massive thank you to Esther for that. Yeah, especially on a day like today where I suppose you were going to be at the memorial of Ken Saro-Wiwa. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for taking us through all of that. I think we're going to go into some breakout groups, I think, and we've got 2 questions that we wanted to cover. I don't know whether, Zoe, have you got those questions?
Well, actually, I think, Michael, we're going to do some feedback for, like,
yeah, we're going to do 15 minutes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. We've got 15 minutes now to ask any questions that we want to Esther. And you can either pop those in the chat, or you can pop up. You can turn your camera on, turn your mic on, and ask away. But yeah, we'll open the floor up, I suppose, to 15 minutes worth of questions, if that's all right with you, Esther. I think
that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any questions or people or comments or clarifications? Or
I've definitely got a comment. I think it was very stark, just noticing that the historic work that's gone on in this. So sort of, talking of sort of 1778 as being a first piece of even published literature. So this has been going on since, since it started, sort of thing. So it's just an acknowledgement maybe that, although it's in the news, or it's popular now, or it's being talked about a lot now, it's been going on for, 250 plus years. So I thought that was a really, really good place to start.
And every generation since, I mean, obviously I had limited time, and don't worry about what you missed. I always have more slides than what I can physically present in the time that I have. It's just what I do, because I tend to maybe want to jump around and emphasize certain things. But in every generation since that time, the mid 1700s, there have been African people of African heritage and ancestry, however they self-defined, who have been making arguments for repair in the way that I've explained it, the meaning, not in a narrow, pay us the money, where is the money, you owe us, which is how the mass media presents this movement.
I think Lorna had a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esther. So much useful things to follow up and look at. But I was particularly interested, I've just started working at a university, and it's interesting seeing how the language of decolonization is kind of being colonized, I think.
Yes.
So I was kind of interested in the cognitive justice bit, and just if you wanted to say anything more about that, or if you had any good examples of where we as kind of white workers in university systems, like where you've seen good practice there.
So yeah, the universities are a big piece, because they're a big part of the problem, but can also be a big part of the solution, because they are focused on knowledge production, okay? But a lot of the knowledge production has been colonial, has actually furthered epistemicide, which is the death of our own knowledges. And many of us who are of African ancestry have to some degree internalized that, because we've all been miseducated under the same system, and don't think it's necessarily any better in African and Caribbean countries, because they are still having to decolonize as well. So the cognitive justice dimensions are very, very important. In fact, if I had the time to elaborate further on that, there can be no reparatory justice unless there's global cognitive justice. Okay, because a big part of the harm was about the way in which our own knowledge systems and values and cultures and cosmovisions were demonized, were trampled upon, were considered uncivilized, savage, fetish, which also had an impact on our ability to continue. I mean, forms of cultural survival and retention, say in the Caribbean, like drumming, which came from Africa, were outlawed. Our forms of spirituality, which were, Mother Earth centered, okay, were demonized and considered to be witchcraft. And we also know what happened in Europe. around women and others who were closer to nature, who were similarly persecuted. So the cognitive justice aspects of it, even for myself as a reparationist, I've had to unlearn a lot of the perceptions I had about, as a very knowledgeable person, worldwide activist on this, in this movement, because a lot of the time, because we're using English, that is part of the problem. So a lot of the way in which activism has been happening and the knowledge production has been happening has not necessarily been written down. So a lot of female activists historically who didn't write books, you know, who didn't have people who were transcribing every word that they said like they did with men, are hidden from our story. Yeah, those herstories are missing. Also, because the term reparation in English is what we use, a lot of the time people don't see reparations activism unless it's couched with that kind of language. And oftentimes, unless it's couched in compensation arguments, mainly. That's a form of the cognitive injustice, because what I discovered is a lot of African people, not just on the continent, but in Abya Yala, the so-called Americas, historically, who were about developing settlements, developing communities, maroonage, which was about a sense of rebuilding, a sense of who we were, despite the fact that we were displaced and disconnected. That was part of how we survived, and we continued to develop culture and family, you know, despite what was going on around us and the structural inequalities that we had. But that is often missed out, because if the word reparations is not there in the scholarship, then people are not seeing them as reparations activists. One of the examples of good practice has been the development of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations that I co-founded as well, which probably shouldn't be surprised. I've been involved in every major setting up of any reparations initiative probably over the last 20 years. And it was initiated as a result of a critical engagement between PARCO, the coalition that is my primary coalition, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. In 2015, we went to a conference, well, we saw advertised a conference being organized by two establishment academic scholars, one racialized as white and one African-American, Professor Joyce Hope Scott and Dr. Nicola Frith, based at Edinburgh. And when we looked at the program, a lot of the scholars on reparations were white, which is not a surprise because it's the same thing around historic enslavement, which is part of the inequality as well around who gets to tell our narrative. But just the way in which the movement was being framed was very, very exclusive, exclusionary. There was a fee. So we challenged the organizers and said, look, this is, you know, cognitively unjust, and you are only promoting establishment academics, even if they're racialized as Black, who are fitting into this paradigm of Eurocentrism and the way these are the way conferences are organized that are not engaging of communities and respecting our knowledges and you know, of scholars and activists who are not in these institutions. Those two scholars invited us to make a presentation and to have a fringe session on the international social movement for African reparations. We also were able to get bursaries for community organizers and activists who would never have been able to sort of afford to go. And then we developed a partnership which led to the creation of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, INASAR. There's a website, so you can Google us. We, you know, we are an international, the only international network dedicated to African reparations around the world, not just in the UK. And it's not just people who have African heritage, it's basically all scholars, although it's led by us, but all scholars or scholar activists working researching African reparations from whatever perspective. So that is a good example. We developed something called the INASAR Principles of Participation, which recognize that this is a movement, that the movement must be that the academics must be accountable to the movement. And the movement has its own knowledge systems, its own ideas, its own ways of producing knowledge, its own terminologies like maangamizi, how we define repair, which must be centered. And so I would say that is a model, because a lot of universities are doing their own thing, especially I can comment on Glasgow University a couple of years ago in terms of signing a deal with the University of West Indies because they discovered when they did their research that they had benefited to the tune of like £20 million in endowments due to enslavement of African people in the Caribbean, a lot of it. And a deal was done between two universities, both colonial institutions, the University of Glasgow and the University of the West Indies. And anyone who knows anything about Columbus discoveries, which were not, he got it wrong. It was not the West Indies. So to have an institution of higher learning that still calls itself the University of the West Indies is an example of the coloniality that remains. And we challenged this as the Stop the Manganese campaign. We wrote to Glasgow, and we said, okay, this is good that you've done this research and you've discovered that this is kind of what you benefited, but the starting point must be to have open up for dialogue with your student communities, your academic communities, your local communities in the area, the wider communities in this country, international communities, because a lot of so-called overseas students who experience academic racism, having to pay these extortionate fees, which is part of the system of coloniality, then how can it be fair that you decide between you as two institutions that the equivalent of £20 million would go to that particular institution? And then you decide that you will set up a University of Glasgow, University of the West Indies centre, with Glasgow being first. So who is defining for whom? Where is the agency for those who have been enslaved? No agency. And really what is happening is that institutions are taking it upon themselves to judge themselves and to pat themselves on the back and say, haven't we done a great thing? Even though we wrote to them, they ignored our letter. We were the only people that wrote to them at that time and were calling for dialogue, because we were saying there are other stakeholders who need to be heard on what should happen as a way forward. Totally ignored. And that cannot be ethical, because it wasn't students at the University of West Indies that were enslaved. It was my ancestors too. My parents were born in the Caribbean. In fact, my father was born in Barbados. My mother was born in South America, in Guyana. So this notion that I could be called a Black British person and my ancestry through DNA is actually West African. So who am I? I cannot be reduced to these little boxes of these European states that colonize my people. I'm claiming all of it, which is why Pan-Africanism is what many people like us embrace, because it means that we don't have to stop with different parts of limitations of our journey and our narrative. So those are some of the examples of how cognitive justice is playing out in universities. But INASAR is definitely, for me, the model that should be looked at. And what we encourage is that universities sign up to the principles of participation in their endeavours. And that is happening with a similar reparations process that is being explored by the University of Edinburgh and hopefully many others. Okay, so I think okay. I see one here from Jane. If I can quickly address this and then have a brief discussion in the groups, that would be good. So, for climate activists, much of my energy is focused on getting governments to reduce the green. Yeah. For me, climate justice is racial justice, because people can't. Yes, do you back this work to get governments to reduce their emissions? Yes, I do. I am also an environmentalist. I am a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Internationalist Solidarity Network, have been involved with Extinction Rebellion from before it announced itself to the public in October 2018. And this work that we do as the XRISN, as we call ourselves, is about amplifying the communities of resistance in the Global South. So when I began with Ken Saro-Wiwa and Elom, these are environmental activists who are also reparationists. So I am part of efforts to get governments to be held to account, especially in relation to the Global South and the impact that the climate and ecological emergency or crisis is having in terms of genocide and ecocide right now. This isn't 10, 15 years to come, this is right now. But it's a nuanced conversation for me because a lot of the focus, say, on COP has been about loss and damage. And that in itself is not really reparations. That is a kind of compensatory framework, but they're not really seeing it as compensatory. And it's not truly, so even using the term climate reparations and just focusing on loss and damage and then saying this money needs to be given to Global South governments without a responsibility on those Global South governments to also change the paradigm of maldevelopment. So, which is what we've been forced into, but there are examples of some countries where there have been strong social movements, like in Abya Yala, such as Ecuador, such as Bolivia, with the rights of Mother Earth, where indigenous communities have forced their governments to be accountable. So when you look at, say, how Brazil treats its indigenous people, even Guyana, where my people come from, and Guyana is, engaging in oil exploration, more and more oil exploration. It cannot simply just be give money to the governments themselves that are furthering the models of neocolonialism and harming their people. There has to be a recognition of classism and all the other notions of intersectionality, and how sometimes governments and those who occupy those positions of power end up furthering the very system of domination. So it has to be broader than that.
Thank you.
All right. So I think it would be good if we can have at least a little bit of short discussion in your groups, because there was questions.
Yeah, we think we said we've got time for sort of 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes in the groups, and then we'll come back and we'll people can, if they're feeling brave, can present back what they talked about or pick an example of what they talked about. So are we going to share the questions on the screen, or are we just going to read them out? Did we decide?
They're in the chat just now. If anybody can't see that, would like it sharing some other way, let me know. I can do that.
Yeah, we'll give you a couple of minutes just to write those down. And I think we're going to put you into groups of 4 potentially.
Yeah, we've got some 3s, but we're mostly 4s, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Unless if anyone's got a problem, give us a wave now. Otherwise, I shall open the breakout rooms. Don't see any objections. You can always message me if you need any help, and I can join you. All right, enjoy.
Brilliant.
Jay, shall I just jump into one? I don't think I've been assigned.
No, I don't think I could assign you. You were not on my list, weirdly. So yeah, can you join? Have you got the control to join?
Yeah, I can just choose one. Yeah, I think it's because I'm a host, maybe.
Yeah, so I've put all of us into room 1 just in case we had any admin to discuss. So you can either do that or any of the other rooms. I mean, you can see. I forgot you could see.
Oh yeah, I'll just join a room unless there's admin to discuss. There's one with 2, so.
Oh yeah, that would be good.
Cool.
Yeah.
See you in a bit.
All right. See you in a bit. Hey, Sarah, how you doing? Hey, oh, you go. Michael, are you taking us through this feedback, or shall I take over? Are you doing okay?
Sorry, my laptop had 3% battery. Fab. So, does anybody want to share any of the things that they just spoke about as a group? I think we've probably got time for 2 or 3, depending on how long we go on for, but we're very close to the end already. Go on, Maya. Maya's going to go.
We didn't have time to talk about the second question loads, but we sort of dipped in and out a bit to both of them. But I guess the impact of the Mangamizi on people of racialized as white, I think also trauma in a way of being like the impact, being racialized as and being part of being the oppressor, and sitting with I think that just does something to your psyche of not being able to like confront that and be honest, and like constantly living that lie that you're trying to like hide and run away from the shame and the guilt around it. So I think it like, you know, impacts our humanity as well. So I think there's a lot of healing that can be done from engaging in movements for holistic reparatory justice. And I loved how holistic the solutions were, and I loved the like boldness of the vision that I don't feel like I've ever had the courage to dream that big. So I was just like in awe listening to it all, being like, yes, yes, yes. And I guess our role could be to, just serve that vision, because it can't be led by us. We can't make those solutions. I don't know what everyone else had thoughts on.
Thank you.
We talked about the facts people racialised as white are impacted by the episteme side, was that the term? Mm-hmm. As well, the killing of knowledges or restriction of knowledges from other cultures. So we're limited by that as well, and what we've missed out on by kind of letting the world evolve with one small group of thinkers leading the way, I suppose. And of course, the eco side as well massively impacts everybody. So that's kind of some of the things that we discussed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just maybe, this is just my own personal reflections, but you know, the link between climate justice and reparations just shows that reparations are everybody's concern. Mm-hmm. You know, the planet is all of ours, and obviously it has its roots in the extraction of resources and people from Africa, but it also you know, has a long-term impact on the entire planet. And by pursuing reparations, we can also, you know, heal the planet at the same time. It's quite grand, but it's just some personal reflections.
Absolutely. It's what Professor Wigari Matai argues.
Just looking in the chat, what we've got down here.
Finding the tiny space for a process of imagination, visualization.
Oh, my echo's on, sorry. I've got a strange setting that makes everything echo. Apologies.
Oh, I was wondering why I was sounding like that.
Sorry. It's a nightmare.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything else to share before we close out? I know I spoke a lot.
Yeah, I suppose as well, if anybody has any questions, if anything comes to you after the session, we can you can always send them through to us, and maybe next time when we catch up with Esther, we can talk about them and we can continue that discussion. So I think we'll just close up again by saying thank you to Esther for taking the time today, especially considering the day it is and where you would usually be on this day. So thank you very much for being here. I kind of just written down a few of my own thoughts. I think one of the things we just talked about whilst we were in our little breakout group was it doesn't feel like there can be systemic change on racism without reparative justice. It doesn't feel like unless you really restore and repair the things that were broken, that you can really get a new result almost. I think I'm just trying to think what I've written here. Yeah, and how we incorporate, I think it was a thought, how do we incorporate some of Esther's work, but if we're thinking about how we're going to be accountable, and the reason, for doing this and how we incorporate Esther's work into our own anti-racist practice is how we define reparations. So I think it was, it being about sort of the repair of nationhood, education, health, criminal justice, wealth and poverty, and not just being that headline statement around, monetary reparations. I think is really important. So that's definitely something we could all take away to think about how we incorporate it into our own anti-racist practice. But yeah, I think we said we were gonna, there's ways in which you can sort of do some direct action. So I think you've got the Stop the Mangamese campaign, actual, signature signing thing, which we will send round to you, so you can all put your names on the bottom of that. And then also, how do we start a conversation about maybe lobbying Leeds City Council into thinking about reparations? Obviously, a city that massively benefited from, cloth and cotton and all of that. How do we make the city? It's obviously quite obvious in places like Bristol and Liverpool, where there's a direct they're sort of port towns with a direct route, but how do we maybe bring it to life within Leeds and use the resources and connections we've got in the city? But yeah, I don't know whether you wanted to say anything else, Esther. I think we've got a couple of things we wanted to highlight, but I'll let you say anything else.
Yeah, I'm just reading the comments, and I think all the comments are great. And there was one about elected officials and stuff who kind of come from movements. I think that's really important. I also wanted to emphasize, since the nature of this course, why I focused those questions and wanted you to reflect, which I know won't just happen today. Hopefully you'll carry those reflections on, is the role of people racialized as white, is that in several of the things I mentioned in the timeline of the last 20 years, and in particular, the motions, it was us working with white people, and in particular the Lambeth motion, Councillor Scott Ainsley, who happened to come on the 2019 African Emancipation Day Reparations March and was blown away by the amount of people he saw and the strength of the advocacy and the passion and the colour. And he was like, how can I assist this movement? And we co-drafted these reparations motions, and his job was to go and get other members of his party, but also cross-party, which is difficult when you're a minority councillor, like a Green councillor, and it's a Labour-dominated council, to get them on board. So I'm really emphasising that this is work where there's a lot that people racialised as white can do in solidarity, in working equitably with us as movements. But also, one of the things that I would advocate is one of the organisations I'm part of, the organiser that co-organises the 1st of August reparations commemorations, is the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee. And we have this motto: education is preparation for reparations. So for us, even in terms of public conscientization, it begins with educating people. First and foremost, about what is the meaning of reparations? What is its depth and breadth? How does it relate to all people? Because we don't want an animal farm situation where we end up replacing the oppressors and replicating those same models, which happens when you don't pay attention to your own internal need to self-repair and to undo behaviors that are maladaptive, that you might have developed as survival, but which no longer serve you in these times as a people or a group. So I really wanted to just encourage people to find ways to, and there's also this notion of voluntary reparations. So wherever you work, whatever your passion or interest in, there's a way in which you can open up these discussions on repair, you know, and be part of the solution. Even if it's just in your workplace, well, how does this relate to what we do that might seem disconnected? How can we look at how harm is continuing in the same way that many workplaces now are having to look at their environmental impact? Yeah. So yeah, that's just all I would encourage you to explore as you continue to reflect on anything that was shared this evening, either in what I said or in your breakout discussions, or any thought processes that you may come up with, because I guarantee you there will be further thought processes that you will be having going forward. Thank you.
Fab. Thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, we're going to send, Jay, we're going to send an email out with a load of resources on and links to bits. Yeah.
Esther's been generous enough to share a bunch, so I've collated those, and I'll send it through Eventbrite, but it's also in the chat.
Yeah.
If I catch it straight away.
And then just a plug, so there's RGN's Race and Climate Justice Group, which has got its next meeting on Tuesday, the 30th of November. And they're obviously going to be discussing basically these themes that we've talked today. So some work already going on along the lines of that. And then there was one other, I had to do one other.
Stop the Scan one, I've got it ready.
Yeah, go on. Sorry, Jay, you go.
Yeah, so another of the Racial Justice Network's campaigns is the Stop the Scan campaign. It's about racist police biometrics. There's a document I'm just going to put in the chat, which if you can help find some capacity to understand a little bit about what's going on, and just send an email, there's a template email to send to the Mayor of West Yorkshire, who is asking for input on policing in West Yorkshire. That would be very, very helpful. A bit of accountable action you could take for RGN.
Brilliant.
Very much.
Fab. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks so much.
All right, great. Thank you. Take care.
Speak to you soon.
And for all your comments as well.
Thank you so much, Esther.
Let me save the chat so I can read them all a bit more deeply. Bye-bye.
Take care. See you again.
Thank you.
Yes.
Should we just stay on for a quick debrief, team?
Yeah.